Northern Montana Territory, November 1878. While most frontier trappers were reinforcing their log cabins with extra chinking and stockpiling cordwood for the brutal winter ahead, an old hunter named Absalom Winters was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. He was digging down instead of building up. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. After all, everyone knew you needed thick walls, a massive fireplace, and mountains of firewood to survive a Montana winter. Yet here was Winters, a solitary man in his 60s, excavating into a hillside like some kind of animal, using methods that looked more fitting for a root cellar than a dwelling. What these skeptics didn't know was that Absalom Winters understood something about thermal physics that most frontier builders had completely missed. Something so effective that it would keep him comfortable through temperatures that killed livestock and froze whiskey solid in the bottle. Before I reveal exactly what he knew, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because in this channel, we're uncovering lost survival wisdom that could literally save your life if modern infrastructure ever fails. Every video brings you techniques that worked when failure meant death. Subscribe, and I promise you'll learn methods that most preppers and off-gridders have never even heard of. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your coldest winter experience has been. Now, let's discover what this old hunter knew that everyone else had forgotten. Absalom Winters had arrived in the Montana Territory in 1876, following the tail end of the fur trade boom. Unlike the younger trappers who built their cabins in the valleys near water sources, Winters chose a south-facing slope 3 miles up Tenderfoot Creek, where the wind hit hardest and the snow drifted deepest. His first action puzzled everyone who saw it. Instead of felling timber for a traditional cabin, he began excavating directly into the hillside, removing approximately 480 cubic feet of earth and clay over the course of 3 weeks. The local Metis trappers, watching from a distance, shook their heads. Even the Blackfeet families who sometimes traded at the nearby post thought his approach was strange, though they said nothing. By late October, Winters had created what looked like a cave with a partial front wall. The structure measured roughly 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet at its highest point. The front wall, the only part fully above ground, stood just 4 feet high and was constructed from river stones mortared with clay mixed with prairie grass. "He's building a tomb, not a home," remarked Dutch Henry, an experienced Montana builder who'd constructed over 40 cabins in the territory. Dutch had stopped by in early November, offering advice that Winters politely ignored. "That hole will fill with cold air like water in a bucket. He'll freeze before Christmas." The criticism intensified when Winters installed his heating system. Instead of a large stone fireplace like every sensible cabin had, he built a small firebox barely 18 inches across, positioned not in the center of the space but offset to the left side, only 14 inches from the rear earthen wall. The chimney, constructed from fitted stones, ran up the interior back wall before exiting through the earth above. "Suicide," pronounced Dutch Henry. "That firebox couldn't heat a chicken coop, and he's placed it where all the heat will just soak into dirt." The man's a fool. What none of them understood was that Absalom Winters had learned his technique 30 years earlier, not in Montana, but in the copper mines of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where Finnish immigrants had shown him how their ancestors survived winters even harsher than these. And he'd seen similar principles during a hard winter spent with a Cree family in Saskatchewan, where earth-sheltered lodges kept families warm while surface dwellings became death traps. But Winters didn't argue. He simply worked, carefully angling his firebox, selecting specific types of stone for heat retention, and maintaining a mysterious confidence that everyone interpreted as senility. The real test was coming, and it would prove who understood heat and who merely thought they did. The technical details of Winters' shelter revealed a sophistication that contradicted its primitive appearance. Every choice he made violated conventional frontier wisdom, yet each had a precise thermal purpose. The excavation depth of 12 feet wasn't arbitrary. At that depth in Montana clay, the earth maintained a relatively constant temperature of approximately 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. While this seems cold, It's dramatically warmer than the -30-degree air that would assault the territory in January. Winters had effectively surrounded 3 sides of his living space with a thermal blanket that never dropped below freezing. The front wall's low profile served 2 purposes. First, it minimized the surface area exposed to cold winds. Second, by keeping the wall height to just 4 feet, with the roof sloping from 7 feet at the rear to meet it, Winters created a compact heat pocket. The total interior volume was approximately 840 cubic feet, compared to the 1,400 to 1,600 cubic feet of a standard 12 by 14-foot cabin. But the truly sophisticated element was his thermal mass system. Behind that small firebox, Winters had installed over 2,800 pounds of carefully selected sandstone. Not limestone, which can crack under thermal stress. Not river rocks, which often contain moisture that explodes when heated. Sandstone, known for its superior heat retention and structural stability under thermal cycling. These stones extended 18 inches into the rear earth wall and projected 8 inches into the living space. The firebox itself was lined with firebrick heat-hauled 60 miles from Helena, creating a combustion chamber that could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while the outer stone surface remained touchable. The chimney design demonstrated equal precision. Instead of a straight vertical shaft, Winters had created a serpentine path through the stone mass, forcing hot gases to travel nearly 6 feet through thermal mass before exiting. This extracted approximately 73% of the heat from the smoke, compared to the 20 to 30% captured by a standard straight chimney. That contraption will fill his hole with smoke, predicted Samuel Grant, a mason who'd built fireplaces across 3 territories. Grant examined the design in late November and pronounced it fundamentally flawed. The draft will never pull properly with all those turns. He'll suffocate before he freezes. What Grant didn't understand was that Winters had carefully calculated his flue cross-section at 28 square inches, slightly oversized for the firebox volume, creating draft pressure that easily overcame the serpentine resistance while maximizing heat transfer. The floor revealed another layer of sophistication. Winters had laid down 8 inches of dry sand, topped with flat river stones fitted tightly together. This created thermal mass beneath foot level and prevented moisture wicking from the earth below. Around the perimeter, he'd trenched a shallow drainage channel that led to a sump filled with rocks, managing any groundwater seepage. Even his door betrayed careful thought. Constructed from 2 layers of split logs with prairie grass insulation between them, it hung on leather hinges and sealed against a stone frame with a clay and fiber gasket. Total thickness, 4.5 inches compared to the typical 2-inch plank doors on conventional cabins. By December 1st, as the first serious cold settled over the territory, Absalom Winters had created what appeared to be a crude hole in the ground. In reality, he'd engineered a thermal battery capable of storing heat for extended periods and maintaining livable temperatures with minimal fuel input. Dutch Henry, riding past on December 3rd as temperatures dropped to 8 degrees, saw smoke wisping from the hillside chimney and shook his head. Poor old fool. I give him 2 weeks before we find him frozen solid. The old fool, inside his shelter, was sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves, watching his small fire slowly charging thousands of pounds of stone with heat that would radiate long into the night. December 18th, 1878 began with an ominous stillness across the northern Montana territory. The temperature at dawn registered 14 degrees above zero, but experienced frontiersmen recognized the signs. A yellowish tint to the northwest sky, absolutely calm air, and a pressure drop that made ears pop and old wounds ache. By noon, the storm hit. What the Blackfeet called a white death, and what meteorological records would later classify as a severe Arctic outbreak, descended on the territory with savage intensity. Wind speeds exceeded 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally and creating conditions where a man could freeze to death between his cabin and his woodshed. In the valley settlement near Tenderfoot Creek, families huddled around massive stone fireplaces, feeding log after log into roaring fires. Dutch Henry's substantial cabin, considered one of the finest in the region, consumed nearly half a cord of wood in the first 24 hours just to maintain a tolerable 55 degrees around the hearth. The far corners of the cabin, despite being only 12 feet from the fire, dropped to near freezing. By December 20th, the temperature had plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. The wind refused to relent. Several families combined households, sharing fireplaces and body heat to survive. Wood consumption became alarming. Dutch Henry calculated he was burning through 4 times his normal daily supply. Up on the hillside, visible only as a slight mound with a smoking stone chimney, Absalom Winter's shelter faced the same brutal conditions. Samuel Grant, the mason who'd predicted smoke-filled suffocation, made a dangerous trek up to Winter's shelter on December 21st, genuinely concerned the old man might be dead. Breaking trail through hip-deep drifts, Grant later reported what he found with something between confusion and disbelief. Before we continue with what Grant discovered, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. This is exactly the kind of survival knowledge that could save your life in a grid-down scenario. Drop a comment telling me about the coldest winter you've ever experienced, and let's keep this wisdom alive. Now back to that frozen hillside in Montana. Grant approached the shelter expecting to find either a corpse or a desperate man burning furniture to stay alive. Instead, he found Absalom Winters in his shirt sleeves, calmly preparing a meal on a small cook surface attached to his firebox. The interior temperature, which Grant later documented in a letter to his brother, registered at an astounding 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The firebox contained a fire barely larger than what you'd use for cooking, consuming perhaps 1/8 the wood of a standard cabin fireplace. Yet the entire space radiated comfortable warmth. Grant placed his hand against the stone mass behind the firebox and jerked it back, shocked by the heat. The stones, charged by days of efficient combustion, were radiating stored thermal energy throughout the shelter. More remarkably, Winters demonstrated that even when he let the fire die completely, the temperature dropped only to 62 degrees over a 6-hour period. The thermal mass was so substantial, and the insulation provided by the earth so effective, that the shelter behaved like a massive storage heater. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began?" Grant asked, struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. Winters gestured to a neat stack in the corner. "That's 3 days' worth. Maybe 4 sticks a day for heating, few more for cooking. About 1/8 what Dutch burns in his fine cabin, I'd wager." Grant did the mathematics in his head. At 18 below zero outside, with sustained wind, Winters was maintaining a 70-degree temperature differential using roughly 12% of the fuel a conventional cabin required. It seemed impossible, yet he was standing in the proof. The storm continued for 8 more days, one of the longest severe cold snaps in territorial record. When it finally broke on December 29th, the settlement conducted an informal survey. Dutch Henry's cabin had consumed over 4 full cords of wood. Other families reported similar or higher consumption. Several had nearly depleted their winter supplies in a single week. Absalom Winters had burned approximately 60 pounds of wood total. The winter of 1878 to 79 became an extended thermal experiment, with Absalom Winters' shelter serving as the control group against conventional frontier construction. What emerged was a dataset so compelling that it would influence building practices throughout the Northern Territories for the next 2 decades. Samuel Grant, converted from skeptic to fascinated observer, began documenting comparative measurements with the methodical precision of a trained mason. Using a mercury thermometer he'd received from a physician brother in St. Louis, Grant recorded temperatures at Winter's shelter, Dutch Henry's cabin, and 2 other representative dwellings throughout January and February of 1879. The results revealed patterns that challenged everything frontier builders thought they understood about thermal efficiency. During periods of moderate cold, between 0 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Winters maintained interior temperatures of 65 to 70 degrees while consuming an average of 4.2 pounds of seasoned pine per day. Dutch Henry's cabin, with its massive stone fireplace and conventional design, required 32 pounds of similar wood to maintain 58 to 62 degrees, and that was only near the hearth. Far corners often registered in the low 40s. The thermal efficiency difference was staggering. Winters achieved superior comfort, using 13% of the fuel. But the most dramatic contrasts appeared during extreme cold events. On January 27, 1879, temperatures dropped to 26 degrees below zero with sustained winds of 25 miles per hour. Conditions were severe enough that 3 settlers in outlying areas died of exposure, and livestock losses across the territory exceeded 200 head. Grant recorded that Dutch Henry's cabin, despite burning wood at a furious rate, could not maintain more than 55 degrees near the fireplace. The cabin's total interior volume and its 6-foot-tall walls created a thermal challenge that no amount of wood could overcome. Heat stratified, with warm air collecting uselessly near the ceiling while floor-level temperatures dropped into the 30s. Dutch estimated he burned 85 pounds of wood that day. At Winter's shelter, interior temperature held steady at 66 degrees. Wood consumption, 6 pounds. The thermal mass effect became increasingly evident as winter progressed. Grant documented that Winter's stone heat bank, once fully charged in early January, maintained what he called a baseline warmth, even when fires went unlit for up to 8 hours. The stones, holding heat absorbed over days of small fires, released it gradually through radiation. The earthen walls and ceiling, stabilized at their constant 45 to 50 degrees, prevented heat loss that plagued above-ground structures. Heat retention measurements told an equally compelling story. In a conventional cabin, when the fire died, interior temperatures dropped approximately 12 to 15 degrees per hour, reaching outdoor ambient in 4 to 6 hours. In Winter's shelter, the temperature decline averaged 2 degrees per hour and would stabilize at around 52 degrees, never dropping below the Earth's constant temperature. This meant Winters could build one fire in the evening, let it burn down to coals overnight, and wake to a shelter still comfortably above 60 degrees. Dutch Henry had to wake twice nightly to feed his fireplace or face frigid mornings. Wood consumption over the full winter provided the most dramatic comparison. For November 1878 through March 1879, Grant estimated that Dutch Henry burned approximately 12 cords of wood, roughly 960 cubic feet of seasoned timber. Other conventional cabins reported similar or higher consumption. Absalom Winters burned 1 cord and approximately 40 additional cubic feet. Total, roughly 168 cubic feet, or 17% of the conventional requirement. The radiant heat distribution also proved superior. In conventional cabins, heat concentrated near the fireplace, creating uncomfortable hot zones and cold corners. Winter's thermal mass radiated heat evenly from the entire rear wall, creating uniform warmth throughout the compact space. Grant noted, "One can sit anywhere in the shelter and feel equal comfort, whereas in my own dwelling, I must choose between roasting near the fire or freezing in the corner." By late February, as word spread through the territory, other measurements began arriving. A trapper named Jonas Webb, who'd built a similar earth shelter design based on Winter's principles near the Judith River, reported comparable results. Interior temperatures in the mid-60s during a cold snap that killed his neighbor's horse, using what he estimated as less wood than I'd previously burned just for cooking. The empirical evidence was irrefutable. Winter's shelter, constructed with methods dismissed as primitive and foolish, outperformed conventional frontier architecture by factors of 6 to 8 in fuel efficiency while maintaining superior comfort. The physics were undeniable. Thermal mass, earth insulation, reduced volume, and strategic heat capture had created a system that worked with natural principles rather than fighting against them. The question haunting Samuel Grant and others who'd witnessed Winter's shelter performance was simple. Where had this old hunter learned such sophisticated thermal engineering? The answer emerged gradually through conversations around Winter's small firebox during the long evenings of late winter. What the old hunter revealed was not a single source, but a convergence of traditional knowledge systems that industrial frontier culture had dismissed or forgotten. Absalom Winters had been born in 1814 in Upper New York State, the son of a subsistence farmer. At 19, he'd traveled to Michigan's Upper Peninsula during the copper mining boom, working underground where he encountered Finnish immigrants who'd brought construction knowledge from Scandinavia. These miners spoke of earth houses their grandparents had built in the harsh northern regions, structures that required minimal fuel despite months of darkness and severe cold. The principle was simple: go down, not up. Use the earth as insulation. Build small. Heat stone, not air. They'd laugh at the American miners, Winters recalled, building big wooden houses above ground, burning forests to stay warm. The Finns built low, dug into hills when they could, and stayed comfortable on what Americans would consider kindling. During the brutal winter of 1843, when fuel shortages caused several deaths in the mining camps, Winters had sheltered with a Finnish family in their partially earth-sheltered home. He experienced firsthand how a structure two-thirds below grade maintained livable temperatures through a 3-week cold snap that paralyzed the region. But the Finnish knowledge was only part of the equation. In 1852, Winters had traveled north into what would become Saskatchewan, trapping and trading with Cree communities. There, he witnessed winter lodges that utilized earth banking and sophisticated heat management. The Cree had developed techniques over countless generations for creating warm shelters in one of the harshest climates on the continent, using minimal fuel and materials. They'd create a small fire pit, heat stones all day, then bank the coals and let the stones radiate through the night, Winters explained. The lodge design kept the heat low where people lived, didn't let it escape upward uselessly. They understood that you heat mass, not space. These communities had also taught him about material selection, which stones held heat best, which would crack, how to create chimney draw without massive structures, where to position fire for maximum efficiency. Knowledge developed through survival necessity over hundreds of generations. Winters had spent that winter in close quarters with families who maintained comfortable conditions through temperatures that regularly dropped below -40, using fires that a European settler would consider inadequate for cooking. The lesson was profound. Size and material consumption did not equal warmth. Understanding thermodynamics did. When Winters arrived in Montana, he recognized the same patterns of wasteful building that he'd seen in Michigan. Large above-ground structures, massive fireplaces, enormous wood consumption, and families who barely stayed warm despite their efforts. It was a system based on brute force rather than understanding. I watched Dutch Henry build his cabin, Winters told Grant. Fine craftsmanship, strong logs, beautiful stonework on that fireplace. But he built it like it was a house in Ohio, not a shelter in Montana winter. Heat going up and out, thin walls facing the wind, massive cold volume to warm. He was fighting the winter instead of working with the earth. The revelation troubled Grant. He himself had built dozens of structures using conventional methods, never questioning whether there might be better approaches. The idea that immigrant knowledge and indigenous techniques might be more sophisticated than American frontier practices contradicted everything his culture had taught him. You mean to say, Grant asked carefully, that the Indians and the foreigners understood building better than we do? Winters poked at a small fire, adding a single stick of wood. I'm saying that people who've survived in harsh climates for generations tend to figure out what works. And people who show up with fixed ideas from milder places tend to suffer more than necessary. By March 1879, as winter finally released its grip on the Montana Territory, a small but growing group of builders and trappers were grappling with an uncomfortable reality. Techniques they dismissed as primitive, backward, or savage were demonstrably superior to their own. The advancement of American frontier construction had somehow moved away from thermal efficiency toward aesthetic convention and cultural pride. The earth-sheltered approach, the thermal mass principles, the compact heat retention design, none of it was new. It had been proven across cultures and centuries. It had simply been forgotten, or more accurately, deliberately ignored by a culture that equated innovation with European and American methods exclusively. Absalom Winters hadn't invented anything. He simply remembered what others had chosen to forget. and that memory had kept him alive and comfortable while conventional wisdom froze and burned through forests. Spring of 1879 brought more than just thawing ground to the Montana Territory. It brought a quiet revolution in frontier building practices, one that spread through the network of trappers, miners, and settlers who'd survived one of the harshest winters in recorded memory. Samuel Grant became the first convert. In April, as soon as the ground softened enough for excavation, he began construction on a new shelter 3 miles west of his conventional cabin. The design borrowed heavily from Winter's principles: a south-facing hillside location, excavation depth of 11 feet, compact interior volume of approximately 780 cubic feet, and a thermal mass heating system using 2,400 pounds of carefully selected sandstone. Grant documented his construction process meticulously, creating what may be the first written technical manual for earth-sheltered frontier dwellings. His notes, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, include precise measurements, material specifications, and thermal performance predictions based on Winter's demonstrated results. By October 1879, Grant's shelter was complete. The following winter provided immediate validation. During a severe cold snap in late December, with exterior temperatures at 22 below zero, Grant recorded interior temperatures of 67 degrees while consuming approximately 5 pounds of wood daily. His old cabin, which he'd left standing for comparison, would have required 40 to 50 pounds for inferior results. Word traveled through the informal networks that connected frontier communities. A Norwegian trapper named Olaf Bergstrom, working the drainages north of Fort Benton, heard about Winter's design from a Metis trader in February 1880. By summer, Bergstrom had constructed an earth-sheltered winter camp that incorporated both Winter's principles and elements from Norwegian turf house design he remembered from childhood. Bergstrom's innovation was to extend the thermal mass concept by creating a raised sleeping platform directly above a stone heat bank. The platform, positioned 4 feet above the floor and built from split logs, allowed him to sleep in the warmest zone while the stone mass below radiated heat upward throughout the night. He reported sleeping comfortably without blankets, even when exterior temperatures dropped below zero. The diffusion accelerated through the winter of 1880 to 81. Dutch Henry, who'd initially dismissed Winters as a fool, quietly began construction on what he called a winter dugout in the fall of 1880. Though he never publicly acknowledged his source, the design was unmistakably based on Winter's principles: hillside excavation, compact volume, thermal mass heating system, earth insulation on 3 sides. Henry's adaptation included some refinements. He created a small anteroom entry that served as a cold trap, preventing warm air loss when entering or exiting. He also experimented with a dual firebox system, one for heating and one exclusively for cooking, though he eventually abandoned the second as unnecessary given the efficiency of the primary system. By 1882, the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Helena began noting earth shelters, or dugouts, in their records with increasing frequency. A survey conducted that year identified at least 23 such structures within a 100-mile radius of the original winter shelter, and likely dozens more in more remote areas that went unrecorded. The design began evolving as different builders contributed innovations. A German immigrant named Friedrich Kohler added a sophisticated ventilation system using a small secondary shaft that created gentle air circulation without significant heat loss. A former ship's carpenter named Thomas Webb incorporated curved roof supports that better distributed earth load while creating a more spacious interior feel. Perhaps most significantly, indigenous communities who had long used similar principles for winter lodges began sharing refinements with settlers who were finally humble enough to listen. A Blackfeet elder named Many Horses taught several trappers about optimal firebox positioning for different soil types and how to create effective moisture barriers using rendered animal fat and clay mixtures. The economic impact was substantial. Families who'd previously spent 4 to 6 cords of wood per winter, representing weeks of labor or significant cash expense, found their consumption dropping to 1 cord or less. The time saved from wood gathering could be redirected to other survival necessities. The reduced fire tending meant better sleep and less risk of fires burning out during bitter nights. Not everyone adopted the approach. Cultural resistance remained strong among many settlers who viewed earth shelters as beneath the dignity of American frontier life, too similar to primitive indigenous dwellings or the sod houses of destitute homesteaders. Some builders attempted earth shelter designs but failed through poor execution, inadequate drainage, wrong stone types for thermal mass, improper chimney draft calculations, and then blamed the concept rather than their implementation. But among those whose priority was survival over appearance, who valued function over cultural convention, the principles spread steadily. By 1885, an estimated 60 to 70 earth-sheltered winter dwellings existed in the northern Montana Territory alone, with similar numbers appearing in parts of Wyoming, Idaho, and Dakota territories where winters were severe and timber increasingly scarce. Absalom Winters, now in his 70s, occasionally received visitors seeking advice. He shared his knowledge freely, asking nothing in return except that people think about what the earth offers before fighting against it. He'd build a small traditional cabin for summer use, but returned to his hillside shelter every October, where he continued to spend winters in comfort that many conventional homes never achieved. The legacy wasn't just technical. It represented a broader shift in how some frontier settlers approached building and survival. Instead of importing techniques from milder climates and forcing them to work through brute material consumption, they began adapting to local conditions using principles proven over generations by people who'd actually mastered those environments. The old hunter's primitive hole in the ground had sparked a quiet revolution in frontier thermal engineering, one that saved countless cords of wood, prevented untold suffering during brutal winters, and possibly saved lives during the most severe weather events. All because one man had been willing to remember what others had been too proud to learn. The winter of 1886 brought temperatures so severe that it would later be called the Winter of Death across the northern plains. Cattle died by the hundreds of thousands, effectively ending the open-range ranching era. Conventional homesteads burned through wood supplies that many couldn't replenish. Some families abandoned their claims entirely, unable to endure the relentless cold. In earth-sheltered dwellings scattered across the territory, families weathered the crisis with hardship but survival. The thermal principles that Absalom Winters had demonstrated, thermal mass, earth insulation, compact heated volumes, proved themselves once again under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Samuel Grant, documenting the winter in his detailed journals, calculated that his earth shelter used 68% less wood than his old cabin would have required, while maintaining superior comfort. More importantly, when late winter storms made wood gathering impossible for days at a time, his thermal mass system allowed him to stretch his fuel supply in ways that conventional homes could not match. The difference, Grant wrote, was not merely comfort or economy, but potentially life itself. Had I still been in my old cabin during the 3-day blow in February, I would have faced a choice between dangerous exposure, seeking firewood, or watching my family slowly freeze. In the earth's shelter, our banked heat carried us through with fuel to spare. The vindication was complete, yet it came with a sobering realization. The principles that had saved lives in 1886 were not new discoveries. They were ancient wisdom that European settlers had dismissed or forgotten, choosing instead to replicate building methods from climates that bore little resemblance to the harsh continental winters they now faced. Indigenous peoples across the northern regions, from the Cree to the Blackfeet to the Inuit, had developed sophisticated thermal engineering over countless generations. Finnish, Norwegian, and other Nordic immigrants carried knowledge of earth-sheltered building from ancestors who'd survived Arctic conditions. Yet American frontier culture had largely ignored both sources, preferring to struggle with inefficient imported techniques rather than admit that primitive or foreign approaches might be superior. Absalom Winters died in the spring of 1889 at age 75 in the hillside shelter he'd built 11 years earlier. He'd survived every winter in comfort, using a fraction of the resources his neighbors consumed, living proof that understanding basic physics mattered more than cultural assumptions or conventional practices. His shelter remained functional for another 2 decades, used by subsequent trappers and miners. When it was finally abandoned around 1910, it wasn't due to structural failure, but simply because the fur trade had collapsed and the area depopulated. The thermal mass stones, the earthen walls, the fundamental design, all remained sound after 30 years. Today, more than a century later, off-grid enthusiasts and survival experts are rediscovering the same principles Winters demonstrated. Modern earth-sheltered homes, berm houses, and underground dwellings apply identical thermal physics: thermal mass for heat storage, earth insulation for temperature stability, compact volumes for efficiency, strategic passive solar orientation. Contemporary builders using advanced materials and precise engineering regularly achieve results that mirror Winters' 19th century performance. 70 to 90% reductions in heating costs compared to conventional above-ground structures, stable interior temperatures with minimal energy input, comfort that doesn't depend on massive resource consumption. The irony is profound. In our age of advanced building science and sophisticated HVAC systems, we're validating approaches that frontier settlers dismissed as ignorant and that indigenous peoples had perfected centuries earlier. We're learning, slowly and expensively, lessons that were freely available to anyone humble enough to observe and ask. The central lesson isn't about construction techniques. It's about the cost of cultural arrogance and the value of traditional knowledge. When we dismiss practices as primitive simply because they come from people we consider less advanced, we often reveal not their ignorance, but our own. Absalom Winters understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. Effective solutions come from understanding principles, not from following conventions. The Earth offers consistent temperature and massive heat storage capacity. These are physical realities, not matters of opinion or cultural preference. Working with them creates efficiency. Fighting against them creates waste. Every winter, as modern homes consume massive amounts of energy to maintain comfort, we're relearning what Winters knew in 1878. The most sustainable, efficient, and resilient shelter systems often aren't the newest or most technologically complex. They're the ones that work with natural principles that have always been there, waiting for us to notice. Before you go, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button if you found value in this forgotten wisdom. Second, subscribe to this channel because we're dedicated to uncovering survival knowledge that actually worked when failure meant death. No modern fluff, just proven techniques from people who had no safety net. Third, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and whether you'd consider building an earth-sheltered shelter based on what you've learned today. The knowledge in this video isn't theoretical. It's verified by survival, proven by extreme conditions, and validated by physics. In a world where infrastructure is increasingly fragile and energy costs continue rising, the old hunter's secret might be more relevant now than ever. One final note. This content is educational and historical. Any building project requires proper engineering, local code compliance, and professional consultation. The techniques described here are presented for knowledge and inspiration, not as construction guidance. Absalom Winters died over a century ago, but the principles he demonstrated, thermal mass, earth insulation, working with natural systems rather than against them, remain as valid today as they were on that frozen Montana hillside in 1878. Sometimes the best path forward requires looking backward to the wisdom we were too proud to learn the first time around.